We have a guest who's joined us in the studio for a new conversation. Ambassador MACHARIA KAMAU is currently the special envoy of the East African Community Facilitator for the DRC, former President Uhuru Kenyatta. And he is, of course, the immediate former Principal Secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And before that, he's worked in diplomatic missions all over the world, including at the United Nations, where he did many things. Balozi, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Kenya's biggest conversation.
Thank you.
We call that the hot seat of the Situation Room. It's an honor to have you there. Just make yourself comfortable. We'll be very diplomatic with you.
Thank you.
We'll start, for example, with an African proverb. ICT.
Yes, our proverbs for this week come from the country of Madagascar, the second largest island country on the planet. Govern the country as you would roast a crocodile on a spit.
Govern the country as you would roast a crocodile on a spit.
Yes, that's their proverb.
Ambassador MACHARIA, what do you understand from this proverb?
I have absolutely no idea. I would imagine, though, that it means that one must be extremely careful when governing a country, because the consequence of not succeeding in your attempt to roast the crocodile could be consequential and, in fact, could cost you your life.
So govern a country carefully. You must be aware of any consequences should you fail.
That is right.
All right. Ambassador KAMAU, there's a lot that you're doing now as a special envoy of the EAC facilitator. First of all, it's called the Nairobi Peace Process.
Yes.
And we've been seeing the conversations on what's happening in the DRC. Just take us through the work that's been done so far. First of all, why the Nairobi Peace Process?
First of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's great to be here on Spice FM. The first thing I'd like to say is that the official name is the East African Community-led Nairobi Peace Process for the Restoration of Peace and Stability in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Where?
It's a long title.
Yeah.
But it's a very important title because it sends the signal that this is a community effort led by all the heads of state in East Africa. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing. Secondly, we call it the Nairobi Process as a shorthand so that we can get people to quickly understand what we are trying to do. The process commenced last year. Everybody forgets that it's only been a year. And within that 12 months, there has been incredible developments. In fact, monumental developments, if you look at this in a historical context. In reality, the Eastern DRC has been in turmoil for over 30 years.
Yeah.
Hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives, if not millions. There has been incredible damage to property, to infrastructure, and basically a cessation of development as we know it in the rest of the continent because of the consequence of these years of fighting. So you can imagine a country like ours not having seen any peace or stability for 30 long years. And then we started with the initiative of His Excellency President Uhuru Kenyatta then, and the current and still remaining President of the Republic of the DRC, President Felix Tshisekedi. And together they decided that they would try and work to see if they could accelerate this process of bringing peace to the DRC, in spite of all these efforts that had come before them. And they convened 3 conclaves with their other counterparts, the other presidents of Eastern Africa, and very quickly came to the conclusion that if they came together as leaders of East Africa, they could pull this off. They could bring peace to the Eastern DRC. And they have formed and initiated a process which, as I said, has a very long name, but we now call it the Nairobi Process. And in the context of that, in less than 12 months, we have been able to convene 3 critical meetings, Nairobi 1, 2, and 3, which have consequenced a situation which has never been witnessed in the Eastern DRC, as I said, in a very, very long time, which is that there has been a cessation of hostilities and fighting in South Kivu and Tanganyika. There has been a reduction of violence and killings in North Kivu and Ituri. There we still have a little bit of work to do. We are only 12 months.
Right.
Remember that President Uhuru Kenyatta, then president, was appointed the facilitator on the 22nd of July. It's not even been a year.
Yeah.
And within that time, working with all the heads of state, working with the current government of Kenya, which has been helpful in its own way to try to ensure that our military remains in the DRC, we have been able to bring a situation of stability and hope. However, we are still faced with some fundamental challenges.
Ambassador, even as you say this, I've always been an advocate to say that there is some kind of merit to being involved in the solving of one's own problems.
Correct.
Previously, if you look at the issues in Eastern DRC, there have been calls from external forces for peace. There have been invitations for people to come and have a conversation, but the calls have been external. Do you think that the nature of the invitees to this peace process, as it were, being from the continent, being the leaders from the region, has had something significant to do with this unprecedented action that we've seen in just 12 months?
Absolutely. Without the leadership of President Felix Tshisekedi himself, without the engagement of his own government, without his willingness to join the East African community only last year in March, without his commitment to remain a party and a partner to this process, we would not be where we are today, despite all the challenges that we have faced. Peace processes do not move at lightning speed. It's not been the history of peace processes in the world. And therefore, we should all exercise extreme caution and patience when we are engaging peace processes, because people have to unlearn bad habits. People don't carry guns for 30 years, pillaging and raping and running amok, and then suddenly put their guns down and decide to be regular peaceful citizens. It's not how humanity plays out. And therefore, we have had to really exercise extreme caution. And remember also that the heads of state of East Africa gave themselves 24 months for this process. We are only just under 12 months. And so even if we were to be evaluated on the basis of a timeline, we're only halfway through what it is that we have committed ourselves to do.
What's the target at the end of the 24 months?
Peace and stability in the Eastern DRC.
So that means what? That means disarmament of the population. That means government is more present. That means now development in these areas.
Exactly.
And the metrics would be, what's the first most visible metric? Of course, when you say peace and stability,
the first visible matrix, to use your term, is cessation of hostilities. You have to stop fighting. Then, indeed, for the armed groups, of which there are many, we tend to hear of the M23 a lot, but that's probably because they are the most well-organized, the most well-capacitated, the most embedded. But nonetheless, there are many. And there are some that are actually a lot more vicious in the sense that they are terrorist groups like the ADF. But if we can get all the armed groups to lay down their arms, to engage in the disarmament and the development process systematically to rejoin their communities as civilians, then we have clear hope. And as I said, since Nairobi 3, which is the third conference that we held here in Nairobi last year in November, we have seen many armed groups putting down their arms, rejoining the government effort for what they call DDR, to try to begin to give themselves a role in development, to rejoin their communities, and to become a constructive part of the society of the DRC. Now that's an area from Tanganyika, Maniema, all the way through to Bukavu, the whole of South Kivu, into North Kivu. And by the way, this is an area the size of Kenya. It's not a small area. Yeah. It's just the Eastern DRC. It's a whole 2-3 countries of East Africa together. And yet we have seen this. So we remain very hopeful. We remain very committed. And I know the facilitator, the former president, continues to do his best to try to ensure that we in East Africa remain committed and that the people of the DRC enjoy this peaceful outcome that we all aspire for them.
For conflict to last this long, there must exist groupings of individuals or groups of people who benefit from it. How does one get them to understand that the peace that you're advocating for is of greater benefit than what they've had for the longest time?
It's a challenge. First of all, this is the core business of the government of the day. There is nothing that an external facilitator can do beyond encouraging and urging peace to change the hearts and minds of the people themselves. This has to be a self-driven process coming from within the body politic of a nation. And I am confident that the DRC is already on track. They have already had an inter-Congolese dialogue process that they have been working on for a significant amount of time. And this is the whole idea of trying to get people to move from holding arms as a way of securing livelihoods to engaging in entrepreneurial activities, to going back to the community, to building their lives as a way of building hope for themselves. It is a challenge, as you rightly point out. But this has been witnessed in other parts of the world.
Yes.
Yes, so there's no reason why it cannot succeed in the Eastern DRC.
There are people who have talked about external influence in all these conflicts for all these years, that for such groups to be able to stay so heavily armed, so well organized, they have a way of either making money, and they also have a way of getting all these arms coming to them, all right? So there's a lot of external support that they get. Now, in this process that you are facilitating, how are you dealing with that? With any possible external forces that are here that have been benefiting politically or economically from the turmoil that's in the East, the DRC?
You see, when you're involved in a peace process, there are things you do overtly and there are things you do covertly. And the things that you tend to do overtly are the things that are tied to your mandate in a very overt way. So we are supposed to be leading an East African-led consultative process for the people of the Eastern DRC, working with the government of the day, which is led by His Excellency President Felix Tshisekedi. However, we are not, it's not that we are unaware. The Eastern DRC is honestly a geological and phenomena. That's all I can say. The wealth in this place, the promise of prosperity in this place is phenomenal. Many people are now saying that the third industrial revolution that is upon us right now, digital and otherwise, is predicated on the resources and the wealth that is in the Eastern DRC. So there are very many countries, superpowers, you name them, the United States, China, Japan, the entire European community, Russia, that are embedded in the possibilities that can come out of the Eastern DRC.
Yeah.
To say nothing of the neighbors of the DRC. So you're right. There are companies, commercial companies, that have huge investments, huge aspirations. They are there engaging and busy maximizing whatever benefit they can get from the resources of the DRC. And this is precisely why, one, we must succeed in our peace effort, because the promise for the rest of us is so enormous. Part of the reason why the former president was so determined to work with President Tshisekedi to bring the DRC into the East African community is that he recognized, among many people, that if the Eastern DRC finds peace, if the DRC comes in its full potential into the East African community, it can transform all our lives because it's such an incredible economic engine of possibilities and resources. So, indeed, you're right. There is a challenge. We are dealing with it. We talk to these protagonists. We talk to people around the Eastern DRC, and we try to encourage them. And in fact, without their support, the very countries I mentioned, without their support, we would not be making the progress we are making.
Do you think you need to get to a point where they're called out? Some of these countries, if, for example, I'm sure there have been very many investigations, even when the ICC is looking at atrocities that have been committed in the DRC, they have come across external influence. Do you think it's important that those that have been involved are actually also outed?
They are.
And mentioned?
All the time. We have UN reports, we have AU reports, we have independent reports, international organizations. Many countries have been asked to cease and desist, to play a much more constructive role, and to the benefit of the Eastern DRC. Some of these countries are recognizing that their current engagement pattern in the Eastern DRC is neither sustainable nor desirable, even for themselves. So people are beginning to see that there's got to be a better way of doing business with the Congo, with the DRC, than purely a win-lose, I want to sustain my opportunities kind of engagement.
Situation. The issue of state sovereignty often comes in here.
Right.
And the question has been, and because we're looking at 30 years, we're also looking at years of different presidencies of the DRC. So the question is whether there is an upholding of state sovereignty by the state itself and a respecting of state sovereignty by these external players. Where does it have a role here?
It's everything here. And it's, as we all know on our continent, and in fact in the entire world, leadership is everything. When you have a country that is blessed with leaders who have a real commitment to the transformation and upliftment of the country and its people, beyond just their own self-promotion, things can happen that are tremendous and very promising. Sadly, DRC has had a difficult history of leadership. It is only now that we are seeing with the current president His Excellency Felix Tshisekedi, this determined effort sort of focused on building the global coalitions and the national coalitions that will help the country transition away from this continuous cycle of violence and more violence over time, to trying to engage with his regional partners. As I said, he has brought his country into the East African community in record time. He did not only bring his country into the East African community, but he has shown amazing commitment to try to make sure that the Nairobi process remains on track. Despite the fact that recently we have heard certain worrying comments about disengagement with the East African military forces there, I think the overall momentum and the overall commitment is for peace. And therefore, you're right, leadership is crucial. And in this case, I think we are seeing an opportunity for the DRC to enjoy leadership that might just get it round the corner and get it to be able to, rise as the superpower that it will be one day on this continent.
Right.
This is Kenya's biggest conversation. Ambassador MACHARIA KAMAU is our guest this morning. He is currently the special envoy of the EAC facilitator for the DRC, former President Uhuru Kenyatta. He is here. He's told us about the progress that's been made so far in the Nairobi process. So it's a long one. It's the East Africa community-led what again, Ambassador?
Nairobi process for peace and stability in the Eastern DRC.
There you go. He's also been a former Principal Secretary for Foreign Affairs. He served as an ambassador in various posts. We'll talk about that as well and all the lessons that he's learned in the very many years that he has done serving the country. Ambassador, I see you also came with a book this morning. You've carried a book.
Yes, I have.
What book is that?
This is a little book that I worked on when I was in the UN, working for our government. And at the time, I had been involved in a historical process for the development of the Sustainable Development Goals, which have become the gold standard for global development in our world. And thereafter, I was also requested by the Secretary General and the international community to work on the framework for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals in our world, which is called the the UN Agenda 2030. And this little book is it's actually a primer, really, for students and for would-be ambassadors who want to work in the United Nations to get a sense of the complexity, but it's also a historical record of the inside story and the challenge we faced to put together the first ever global goals, which were universal in nature. Every country in the world was brought into it, and also the whole process of the building of the framework for the implementation of those goals.
Sounds like there was a lot of negotiation into getting every country on board.
It was an amazing journey, I can tell you.
Was there any country that did not believe on the need for development? No. Was there? What kind of convincing did you need to do to bring countries on board?
Yeah, well, it took us 3 years. So of day and night, sometimes negotiations, conferencing, debate, consensus building to get where we got to. It was a very challenging time, but also there was just an alignment of the stars. It would be unimaginable today, for example, in the context of the current terrible relationships at the global level between the superpowers, to have arrived at this opportunity that we arrived at. But everybody loves development, but not everybody wants to agree on how to get there. You see, and nobody wants to be put into a framework that holds their feet to the fire and says that you have to deliver on this time frame over a certain period of time, especially not the big superpowers. See, we in Africa are used to foreigners and
Being
the
told.
UN and others coming to tell us what to do and what not to do. But they don't like it when we turn those tables and begin to say, well, fine, there is a real challenge for development for all of us. And when we finally began to convince the global community that development was a universal project, that every country has developmental challenges, every country. And we finally began to characterize that in a way in which every country saw themselves in the Sustainable Development Goals and saw themselves in the framework. And then we said, now you go out back to your countries and develop your national development targets to achieve these goals. So we're not going to set those targets for you, but we're going to give you the overall Sustainable Development Goals to be attained by all nations, and every country has to ask itself what's going to be its contribution to the achievement of those goals by succeeding in their own country. And once we got people to accept that narrative, then we began to make progress. And finally, many years into the negotiations, we got the nations of the world to sign off on these goals and the 2030 agenda, and the rest is history.
Indeed. To have this kind of conversation where you look previously, I mean, even in the way in which our language is about how we demarcate the world, there's the global north and then there's the global south. And it always seems as though the global north would dictate what was to be done, what was to be heard, and how people would speak in the global south. But it seems, though, that through a lot of processes such as the one that you've just described, and possible conversations that will take place in the near future and moving forward, whether it is the climate agenda, whether it is the development agenda, whatever that may be, and how now nations are becoming interested and vested in the development that takes place inside and outside. How do you see those conversations changing, coming from a place where you've seen these conversations happen, where the dictatorial, almost patronizing, those are the adjectives I choose to use, manner of negotiations and diplomacy took place, and now going to a place where people actually know what it is that they are bringing to the table? How do you see the world's conversations changing as we go forward?
I can tell you that the world conversation has truly changed. We are not where we were just a short 20 years ago. An incredible amount has happened in the world, in the very countries that used to be patronizing, as you put it, dictatorial, instructional. In those very countries, they have had experiences that have shaken them to their core, either political, social, climatic. I mean, they have been humbled by the experience of the last 20 years. And even those countries that had great arrogance about their colonial legacy, because they all thought that this was some God-given right to them, while as we all know now, that in fact it was an exploitative, politically engineered, horribly destructive process. And therefore the humility that has now entered the conversation is truly transformative to all of us. When you see a country like Kenya hosting global conferences, becoming the thought leader, the conceptualizer of the idea for that global conference, let's say the blue economy, and the world coming to Kenya to ask, what is all this about? How do we maximize the opportunities of this concept of the blue economy? Just that was a signal that something fundamental had changed. That we are now dealing more as equals than as servant to master. And we are now getting to the point, and you've even seen with our current president, President William Ruto, himself saying it cannot be that African presidents are carted off to a foreign land, put into a bus, and taken to a meeting to see one leader of another country. I mean, this is where we are now. This is no longer tolerable. And clearly, African leaders are themselves beginning to find their voice, to see a different vision for ourselves and for our continent, and to begin to engage accordingly. And with the Sustainable Development Goals, we can now challenge other countries because there are targets in there. Okay, fine, we have to achieve ours. Have you achieved yours? And are you working on how you treat women in your society? Are you working on how you treat minorities in your society? Are you giving equal opportunity to your people in your country, even as we are challenged to try to overcome our colonial legacy, while at the same time trying to get rid of the very same challenges for women, youth, and children in our society?
You know, there's a very pleasant discussion that we've had in this country. That was the role we played and the eventual position we had in the Security Council. Because for the longest time, that was a conversation we believed only took place when you're referring to the really, really, really big economies. How did we get there?
We got there. It's actually a very good question, by the way, because people think these things happen willy-nilly. You know, it's like falls like manna from heaven.
It's rotational.
You know,
this door it comes.
You know, they have no idea that Kenya took the world by storm, not only because we ended up in the Security Council, but because we had a game plan and we executed on it. I mean, this is not what African countries are known for on the international platform. They will get there because it's their turn, but once they get there, they will become either pawns of other nations,
or rubber stamps,
of other nations, or they'll just sit there, in some cases unbelievably, and say nothing. But not Kenya. Kenya went in, we had a clear game plan, we were transparent and honest about it before we went in, we mobilized global support for our candidacy around those issues. We got people to be excited about them, and this cut across all nations. It wasn't just African countries. We had a vision for let's say countries as far away as Colombia. Imagine the idea of an African country envisioning a different future and a different opportunity for a country on a different continent based on solidarity. And you saw the vice president of Colombia here the other day. This wasn't by accident. No. People really do have to appreciate that these are the consequences of strategic thinking, of strategic policies, of the execution on those policies on multiple platforms, not just in the Security Council, but at the UN and in many other places. And he also witnessed what we were able to do during COVID. Again, we have clear amnesia about certain things. Maybe COVID was a terrible experience and we'd all rather forget it. But to be honest, the way in which we came together at the moment in history when we were all, we had our back to the wall as a world, as a nation, and as humanity, when we were all facing an existential threat that we all recognized could really create havoc on our world. And we were in the council at the time. And we managed to coordinate actions and activities within the council that made sense of the challenges that we were facing as African countries. And we then reached out to the Caribbean and to the Pacific, you see, and worked with them because they were in the same box as we were. We turned health into a global security challenge, and we were able to discuss it in the UN Security Council. So, great question. But it wasn't by accident. It was a lot of hard work, I can tell you.
How do internal ongoings of nations affect international global conversations? We can be out there, can be out there advocating for certain things, sustainable goals, and saying these things must be done. And you know about the challenges that are, internal to any country. It could be here having the conversation here, be South Africa, Egypt, wherever. Knowing the challenges of governance, knowing the challenges of some things that we face like corruption and underdevelopment, how does that affect conversations then that are had on a global scale?
I'm beginning to think I should come more often to Spice FM. I love the line of questioning. You see, one of the great successes that we managed to achieve in the process of doing the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's why this book is called Transforming Multilateral Diplomacy. It's a terrible title, but the point we were trying to do is to send a certain message that in putting together these Sustainable Development Goals, we transformed multilateral diplomacy. Yes. And by this I mean the following. Until then, all these global debates were held by nations. 4 nations, by bureaucrats and technocrats from capitals who would go to the basement of the UN and negotiate into the wee hours of the night, and whatever they agreed upon in there would then become the blueprint for global development. That's how the Millennium Development Goals were evolved. I was involved in that, so I remember. There are many, many other statutes and agreements and all kinds of treaties. That's how they're done. For the first time, we said, and we were able to convince the governments of the world that the United Nations is more than just a destination for governments. It is also a destination for people. It is also a destination for organizations and for companies and for the private sector. And so for the first time we had thousands, and I mean that literally, of organizations represented in the debate. It made for a very complex process. That's why it was such a taxing exercise. But it allowed us to bring in the voices of the people, the voices of NGOs, of civil society, of private sector, of scientists, of technocrats of a very high order into the process. That's why the targets here, all 147 of them, are so amazingly transformative if they were to be achieved.
Right.
Because we worked with so many people. Now, to your question, the people who then owned this process became the global community.
Right.
So, I don't have to go to Zambia or to the United States or to Russia or even to China and convince them and plead with them to take the Sustainable Development Goals as their own. They are signed up. They have now to report on them in July every year and report on them internally to their community, to their constituency, mobilized by their NGOs, and therefore the ownership of the process is theirs. This was almost a sleight of hand on our part, because while they thought they were signing some global thing that maybe they can shelve, like they shelved every other little global thing they like to do, suddenly they realize, no, this has consequences in your constituency, at home, among your people, within your politics. That was the genius of this process. And I've always said the world has yet to appreciate where we are with this, because only time will tell. So we don't have to hold anybody's feet to the fire. The setup is so designed, to do this. It's a little bit like our constitution here in Kenya. there's only so much you can get away with before you bump into the constitutional limits.
You're brought back in.
Yeah.
Have you noticed some of these big powers actually now feeling the heat, so to speak, of the SDGs and what they're doing or not doing?
Absolutely. So, for example, in the United States, it's the most sophisticated, the most powerful, and by far the richest country in the world. Okay?
Okay.
Right there are clear deliverables that are embedded in the SDGs to do with race, to do with gender, to do with equality, equity, to do with pollution, to deal with environmental rehabilitation, to do with the transformation of cities and their impact on climate and climate change in our world, and to become an embedded part of the global community's responsibility on both environment, but also on climate. So, and they speak to these goals themselves. Their civil society and their NGOs speak to these goals themselves in the United States. So I don't have to go there and point fingers at them. They just have to look at the goal set and recognize where their challenges lie.
I mean, again, going back to how these conversations are taking place and evolving over years, if you were to be aspirational in thought, or if you would be predictive, would you see that there would be a merging of the geographical description that has been given to global politic, to global development conversations? Will there be a merging of these hemispheres in the future?
That would be amazingly aspirational, but probably not practical under the global geopolitics that tend to dominate our politics in our world. I think it would be extremely difficult and naive to expect that we were going to be able to suddenly see the global superpowers agreeing on one political agenda and singing Kumbaya
around the campfire.
I just don't see that happening. I don't think it'll happen in my lifetime. But I am hopeful, and I believe that there is a significant transformation. Again, I am a believer in progress and in peace. And let's face it, the progress that we have enjoyed globally in peace and development in the last 30 years has been phenomenal. We are in a very different world, even here in our little Kenya. When we look at what we have been able to do, despite everything, I mean, tuna mashida mengi. I'm not saying we don't have a lot of problems, but if you look at how far we've come, we had jigger-ridded communities from one end of our country to the other when I was a kid. Okay? Vehicles and what we take for granted, healthcare, free education, primary, secondary, this was unheard of. That wasn't that long ago. Malnutrition. I mean, I used to work for UNICEF. The statistics for Kenya in places like Kwale, Nyanza, some pockets of Moranga and other places in the north of our country were horrible. Horrible. These things have changed for the better. Yes, the bar keeps moving because obviously the better you do, the better you must do, because the bars keep moving.
Right.
The way in which women were treated in this society 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, you didn't see them in vehicles driving around the city. You didn't see them as part of the economy in the way in which you see them today. Things have changed. And if you don't appreciate how far you've come, it's very, very difficult to begin to understand that, there is opportunity here for change. We can do better. change is available to us.
Yeah.
We just have to believe and push in the right direction.
That's indeed true.
Would you say that working in the Foreign Service has opened your eyes to this reality more than if you hadn't?
Absolutely. My brother, you and I were in high school together.
Yes, we were.
I can tell you that I consider one of my almost spiritual experiences. I'm not a theological person. My father was the theologian, but I consider the experience of living and working abroad and coming home as I did every year. I'm not one of these people who left and never came. I used to come home religiously. I'm so loving this, with this country of ours. But every time I could see, oh my goodness, there's something here we're not doing right.
Yeah.
The little things, not the big things, just the little things. And you begin to understand that society changes because of the little things that individuals are doing. How do you keep your own street clean? You keep your own street clean. This is your responsibility.
Yeah.
And if you keep it clean, I remember when I first got to Germany, I was just transiting through there. And there were all these little old ladies, everybody who's retired, with a broom cleaning their street. And I thought, well, lo and behold, they didn't wait for the city council, they didn't wait for the truck, everybody cleaned their little part, and therefore everything looked good. From those core responsibilities, from having an education that can teach you to have this social responsibility, what we used to call civic education when we were kids, that has to come back, because that's the promise of success.
Ambassador, you must come back. You agree?
Absolutely.
Very good. Ambassador MACHARIA KAMAU is the special envoy of the EAC, facilitator for the DRC process, former President Uhuru Kenyatta, former PS. He's a former PS, also former Kenyan representative at the UN and all those other places that you've worked. Asante sana for joining us.